afternoon, and welcome to our monthly Dalim Tips and Tricks webinar. My name is Alex, and today we'll be discussing ES metadata. Sorry for the late start here, just still getting a few things put together for this. I think we actually need to update the slides on here, but there should be somewhere towards the top of the GoToWebinar window a zoom button you can use to control the zoom if my screen shows as either too large or too small. So keep an eye out for that. In the GoToWebinar control panel, there should be an area where you can type in questions as well. So if you have any questions about anything I'm showing, type it in there, and at the end of the session, I will review those. If anything particularly pertinent to a point I'm discussing comes up, I may pause to address it too. So, as mentioned, this is part of our monthly Dalim Tips and Tricks webinar series. We do a webinar the third Wednesday of each month. Typically, as soon as we know what we're going to be doing for the next month, we put some information up on our website at blanchardsystems.com/events. I've also been trying to put those up on our Zendesk portal too, so you can also keep an eye out for them there as well. So this is designed to be, we did about 5 or 6 years ago, we did a introductory webinar on how to use metadata in ES. And the webinar itself holds up fairly well, but things have changed in ES over the past 5 years. So some of the options I'm discussing in that webinar no longer exist. There's some new features that handle certain cases better. So we just wanted to refresh the introductory webinar. So this is assuming that you've had some experience with ES. You might not have had any experience with metadata. So we're going to start from the ground up. And we're going to be talking about how you can create metadata sets and properties in ES, how you can set metadata via job tickets and workflows, understanding what metadata scope means when metadata is applied to something in ES, best practices for creating and working with metadata, some common metadata pitfalls you may run into or want to watch out for, and what tool to use for the job, when you should choose metadata and when you should choose one of the other information storage options that ES gives you. So some notes on scope. This is probably going to wind up being a very long webinar. I want to get as much of a bird's eye view of ES metadata into one webinar as I possibly can. So I'm going to try and give a complete conceptual picture of metadata in ES. So it's going to be about a mile wide and about a foot deep. So next year I'm planning to do sometime maybe in January or February a second follow-up webinar, which is going to focus on some of the more advanced uses of metadata that we don't have time to cover in here. There's a lot of things today that I'm going to preview briefly that we'll dig into deeper in that webinar. I'm also going to skim over a lot of other topics that I'll show here that aren't directly related to metadata. So for example, I'll be showing, for example, some smart views. I might be showing, if time permits, some reporting in Elasticsearch, but I'm going to go very quick on those just so that we can keep the focus on metadata. If those are topics that you're interested in, most of those we do have full webinars on already. So for example, I know Mike Moscato did a really good one on job ticketing recently. So I'll show the bare essentials here. And when we post this on YouTube or when we send out the link to it, I'll get together some links on the other relevant webinars for those topics. So first off, what is metadata? Metadata briefly is information that's about or related to something else. In computing, that usually means information that's linked to files, folders, or other items. A good example is if you're dealing with image files, for example, you've got the image itself is, if I have a folder here with, I might have an image here, but there's other information that might be associated with this image that's not the actual image data itself that would be useful to have associated with it. So for example, that might be the camera manufacturer, the date that the photograph was taken, the shutter speed, aperture, film speed that was used. So for example, that's some technical data that tends to get recorded when you take photos. You could also, if you're using these images in a business setting have other process information that you want to capture on your end. So you might be interested in what photographer took the photo, which models were in the picture, and whether or not they signed the release form that they needed for whatever publication you're doing, an associated brand, a project code, or some tags to describe what's in the image. In computing, these are usually embedded in the file via some metadata format. Sometimes they're included as a separate sidecar file that sits along your JPEG, for example, here. Or sometimes in the case of ES for a lot of things, in a program's database. So it might not actually be in the file, but it might be stored in a program that you're using with the file. So as far as ES is concerned, ES uses metadata that's based off Adobe's XMP metadata standard. This is an international ISO standard now, I think. But it's basically a way of describing and storing metadata related to mostly graphic arts applications, so PDFs, images, that sort of thing. You can set this metadata in three main ways. First, you can have existing metadata that comes in when you upload a new file that there was some metadata that might have been set by the camera that took the photo, or it was set in Bridge or Photoshop or something by the photographer, and it already exists in the file. ES can take that and work with that as long as it's XMP metadata. They can also be set via job ticket layouts in ES, where when you upload a file or edit a file, you can manually set the metadata in ES. And the third way you can set it in ES is via programmed links and workflows. So if a file goes down a certain branch in the ES workflow, you want certain metadata to be set based on something that happens. This metadata that we're setting is usually linked to some scope, and that can be something like a document, a project, or a customer, for example. That scope's important because you're telling it what item you're linking that metadata to. Because, for example, in this, the information that we had in this example back here about like the shutter speed and that sort of thing related to a specific photo, it was at that specific scope. If that metadata were stored at the project associated with the project that housed that photo, it might not make sense. Likewise, if you have like a project code or PDF output settings that you have configured for a job in ES, you wouldn't necessarily want that to be stored in the PDF files that get output, for example. So metadata is linked to something or item in ES. And as far as uses of why you would want to do this, four main ones come to mind to me. One is to store useful information in ES so that's handy if you need it. So that could just be like comments, instructions for a print job that has to go to press. And the CSR wants that information in there just for their own ease of access. You can do it to organize or search for files. If you tag files with metadata, for example, that job code we're looking at here, then it makes it easier to search for because you have these specific fields that you can search for, like keywords or job IDs or the photographer's name that you can go back and work with later. You can use it to control workflow and have different things happen. For example, if you set metadata at the project level to control the PDF output type of a job, you could then use that to have twist later on down the line give you, for example, an X1A PDF or an X4 PDF, depending on what you set. You could also alternately have that choose different branches in the workflow. For example, if maybe you've got two different production plants you deal with in Philly and New York, and you want to say if the file is being processed in Philly, then it only should go down this one particular branch. And the last way is to communicate with other programs. Since this is a standard, and as I mentioned, you can pull in metadata that was set in Photoshop or by the camera and use that to control workflow in ES. In the same vein, you can write metadata into files based on things in ES, and then if you pass this to another tool down the line, and that tool supports XMP, then it could read that metadata and act on files in its own way based on what you set in ES. So I think what I'll do first is I think the best way to show this starting off would be to show it from an end user's perspective, and then we can dive into the techie aspects after that. So for example here, if I go to upload files, I have what's known as a job ticket here. I think I have some files here I can take and drag in. So maybe we take one of these files here. My job ticket is, this is maybe we're doing image retouching for some publication, and they want to tag images with a few different things. So we can put, what's the intent? Is this image intended for print or web? So say maybe this one's a print image. Retouch location, is this being retouched in LA, New Orleans, or Philly? Make that New Orleans. Instructions, we'll put in some special instructions there. And an option, is this or is this not a stock photo? I'll click that button and the file will upload. So I'll upload 2 files again real quick. I'll make this one a stock photo. And we'll make this one a not stock photo. Let's see here. Okay, that did work. Sorry about that. So you can see here that because we set the stock photo metadata for this file, it's a stock photo. We don't have a photographer to review the approval info here. So this went straight onto the marketing approval. This other one, since this wasn't a stock photo, it first went to the photography approval step, and I had to approve that before that could move on to the marketing approval. So that's the way you can use that to control workflow. Where this gets interesting is that you can also do this before files get uploaded to ES. If I go to Photoshop, for example, what I did in here is, let me pull another one of these files up. Is this one I haven't used before? So let's use this one. So I have a custom metadata view I built here in Photoshop, and I can put different information in here. Same information I was looking at in ES. So we can set Philly as a retouch location, do intent, it's print, and this one is a stock photo. I can then go ahead and commit my changes to this file. And if I really want to, I think I have the Dalim plugin here. So if I were to go to my project in ES and upload this file, you'll see that it pulled in all of the metadata that I just set in Photoshop, and ES recognized it, and it skipped the photography approval since I marked this as a stock photo when I did the upload in Photoshop. So that way, even if you have users who are working on retouching or something and they're never actually in ES, they can set this metadata somewhere else and then turn around and use it in ES. So, was I going to show next? I think I could do. So the next part of this too is, now that this information's in here, I can also use that to aid search. So for example, I have here that job code. You can see that if I search for my job code, then it finds the file that has that information embedded in it. So, and if you have some of these fields like this that are very specific, like retouch location or something like that, you can also use those to do more complex searches. For example, what they call facets in ES. So for example, if I go down here, I can see all my metadata type. Let me actually turn on my facets for retouch location is stock photo and intent. And then I can see in here, whenever I do a search, I can see a count of how many items I have with these different tags. And if I want to, I can drill down in there and see all stock photos that are intended for web use later on in the process, or all stock photos that are intended for print, and use that to really narrow down and find what I'm looking for easily. If you've got these specialized fields that you deal with in your company, then you can turn around and use those here. Yeah, I've shown how you could show metadata through existing metadata that was from Photoshop, that was created on upload, or was set by the workflow, which is actually the cool one I'll show. So I go back to my other project here. Sorry, I'm jumping around way too much here. And I take one of these files through to the very end of the workflow. So maybe we'll take this one through to the very end. And I actually have a step in here where I'm recording the name of who does this very final approval. And I'm then going to write it into the file for Photoshop to take a look at later on. So go ahead and download this document. And let's open that in Photoshop. And you'll see here that we have some metadata that the workflow itself wrote into this file for Photoshop now. So you can see the final ES user that touched this file, the date and time that it was approved for the last time in ES, a secret message in here that that the ES workflow itself wrote, and then an ES document ID that points to the specific copy of 12987. So if I were to search for that in ES, then I can see that exact file and know exactly where this came from in ES, which copy it was if I had multiple ones flying around earlier on in the process. So that's again to recap from what I was showing there, that you can set that metadata either from existing files through job ticket layouts or through workflow. And then for the uses here, I stored some useful information in ES. We just organized files for search. We use them to control workflow, and we skipped that one step. And then we just communicated with another program by pushing this back into Photoshop and showing the metadata that ES wrote. So the next question, I guess, from there is, how does this thing work under the hood? So what we can do there is, if I go to customization, the first step to setting this up is you need to define a metadata set. So we can go ahead and we can make one, maybe I'll make one called Demo Corp. Now, there's a few pieces of information you need to supply when you set one of these up. The first is you have to give it some kind of a friendly display name that's going to show on screen. That's what's used here elsewhere in ES. You need a prefix, which is the sort of code name for these. If you actually open one of these files up in a text editor, and scroll down, when this gets saved as XMP metadata, it gets embedded into the file. Or does Adobe do it? I guess they do it. I can't show it with that one. Let me pull. I know these PDFs. You can see it. I pull up. Let's pull up this one. So, for example, with this PDF I have here, you can see that the metadata is stored in the file. It's basically tacked into the file, and everything has a designated prefix in front of it. So this would be the kind of friendly name for your metadata set. This would be the actual name that gets used under the hood for the techie bits. This doesn't leave ES, this does. And you also need what's called a namespace, which is just a piece of information that identifies this metadata as belonging to a certain company or a certain use. These are formatted like URLs, but they don't have to point to any real URL in real life. I think these were when the standard was developed and these namespaces started to become popular in the 90s. I think the idea was that you could then put documentation or information about the namespace at that point on your website, but you don't really have to do anything like that. It is important to know, but these are basically used to handle cases of collisions where if you have something called demo and someone else has a metadata set that they call demo, that namespace is used to determine that they're not actually the same metadata or they're not intended to go together. So these namespaces should always be unique for every single metadata set that you create. If they're not, then you can run into trouble. So it's also important to note, we've had some people with the way things are going with security, even though this isn't really pointing to a real URL, we've seen a few IT departments try and get people to put HTTPS in there for secure HTTP. We had to actually have a bug fix for this in ES because the standard doesn't, XMP support for HTTPS in that URL was kind of iffy. So it works in ES now. I was looking online earlier and I've seen there are other applications, if you hand this off to something else down the road, having an HTTPS in there instead of an HTTP might cause problems. This isn't a security risk in this case because this isn't an actual real URL. And even if there was documentation you wanted to put up at that URL, you could have the web server automatically do that HTTPS redirect. If you look at ES ships with some other standard metadata sets that are industry standards, like, for example, was Dublin Core hiding here on me? You can see, for example, they're all listed as HTTP, for example, Photoshop here. So that's just one thing to watch out for, not a major thing, but figured I'd mention it. So we've got our metadata set now. The next step is to create metadata properties, or the information that you want to collect as metadata. So there are certain things you might want to put in. So you could have something like job code or something, for example. These can't have any spaces or special characters. Again, they're the technical name for these things. And you have to choose what type of metadata you want it to be. I should actually let me pop up another browser window very quick here. And I can bring up that metadata set we were having trouble with earlier, because I built one that shows you what all these different types of metadata do. So sometimes it's helpful when you're dealing with these. They have two browser windows open just because it's a lot of jumping back and forth otherwise. So I'm going to go into my job ticket layouts and turn these on real quick. But the gist of this is that there's different types of information you might want to store. So for example, here's a job ticket I made that has all the main interesting types of metadata in here. So for example, we've got a string, which is just plain text. We've got integers, which are whole numbers, floating points, which are fractional numbers, so like dollar amounts or decimal numbers. These name choices, by the way, these are all part of the XMP standard. So if they seem a little strange or a little different from Dalim's normal terminology, that's why. And enumeration basically just means a multiple choice where you can have different options and select one or the other. We've got a date where you can just choose some day on a calendar, time where you can choose a time, a text field, which is like a string, but it can contain a lot more data. So you can make these really long if you need someone to add in paragraphs of text for whatever reason. Encrypted, which is basically like a password field. It's important to note, I don't think these are actually encrypted on the back end. They're just so they're not really super secure, but if you want someone to type something in and you don't want it to display on the screen to end users, you can do that, as long as it's not something that's super sensitive data. Open choice, which is another sort of thing where you can make options for people, but if the option doesn't exist, they can just type in whatever they want to. And then we've got a Boolean down here, which is basically a checkbox that's either true or false. So as far as the more complex types, there are also two database-driven types of metadata in ES. The database user list and the user list and output channels. These are useful sometimes if you're trying to do specific things in a workflow. This will basically show you a list of all your users on the system, so you can go ahead and select a user, and that will store a reference to their account, so that if you need to, for example, list them as an approver or send them an email or something later on, you can refer to that specific user. We also have an output channel section here where you can see all the output channels you have on your system if you want to be able to control delivery on the fly. For more complex metadata types, we're not going to focus on these days today, but I figured I'd at least mention them just so you know they're there. A struct is a grouping of different metadata types that different metadata properties that are basically glued together. So you can glue together like a string, an integer, and a Boolean. So they all act as one unit. These are useful for some under the hood things. I would be careful about using these just for organization because there are some tricks to organizing, to accessing this data in a workflow when it's stored as a struct. Then we've also got multi-item metadata, bag sequences, and I don't think these have a name in the XMP standard or XMP world, but I just call them tables. So a bag is of any other metadata type you want. You can create a list of multiple values, and it basically stores multiple entries of that metadata type, and you can add in however many you want. These don't have to be, I made these just strings or text here. Those can also be, like you could have a bag of integers, for example, or if you're really weird, you could have a bag of checkboxes if you really wanted to. It can be any of these. So you can pull from any of those and it's whatever type you want, you have multiple values. There is a sequence which is the same thing, but it can be reordered. So if I do 2, 2, 3, 1, I can reorder these in whatever order I want if it's a case where sequence matters specifically. So that would be, for example, if you're trying to put approval steps in order or something, you could do that. And the last one down here is a table, which is it's basically a bag and a struct combined together so that you can have complex metadata where you've got different types of metadata that are glued together and in the same row. And you can use that to store more complex information like this. So now for each of these properties in here, you might have some different options too. So for example, with a string, you have the ability to control the maximum minimum number of characters they're allowed to enter. So if you wanted to limit something to 4 characters, you could type in like 1 to 4 here, and they would have to have something that was in between those character counts. And beyond that, you could even have a regular expression in here. So for example, if you've got a job code that starts with 2 letters and then any number of numbers, you could do 0 to 9 plus, then you could do that, and it won't let them save the value until they save something in that value until it has the appropriate formatting. So that way, if you're trying to get an email address, you make sure that it actually is formatted like an email address, and they didn't just type no in the line. You can do some verification on that data. Likewise, for something like an integer, you also have the ability to control, for a floating point, how many decimal places are they allowed to enter? For an integer, what the minimum and maximum numbers are allowed to enter in that field are. Things like that. So there are slightly different options for each of those. I'm thinking actually for a good example would be, we can make a quick customer job ticket. So maybe if we've got information on, because that's one that I don't see used a lot, maybe we've got a customer contact. Or actually we could have a CSR. We can make that a enumeration, which is the drop-down list. So we've got Jim, Sue. So we'll make our drop-down list that way. Since these have to be the technical names and you can't have spaces, if you want to have a more complex name down here, you can put a translation in that will display in the interface. And save that. So we've got a CSR. We could do maybe a text field for special notes. I think what else we might want for our customer metadata. We could have, if you needed to synchronize this to another system via an API, you could have string here for like MIS ID. Now for each of these properties, we also have a few different things in here we can do. These can be set either at the whole job ticket level or individually. Required means that metadata, whenever it appears in a job ticket, has to be set before the job ticket can be saved. So if you've got something really important like a CSR, you have to have that set. You can control a default in here if you want to give someone a default. Maybe our default is nor is our default CSR. We can make MIS ID is required. We've also got these searchable, available, and layout, save in XMP, and unique value. Searchable means this is something that we're allowed to search, that users are allowed to search for. You might have some cases where you have a piece of metadata that's specific to workflow and you don't want anyone to be able to search for that. So you can uncheck the search option in here, and that'll hide that from them on the search screens. That's just strictly for workflow or whatever. Available in layout says that this is allowed to be used in a job ticket layout. Save in XMP means that if you tell ES to write metadata to files, you want it to store a copy of this property in the file itself when it writes out. So there might be some things, again, where you've got internal options where you don't want the special notes to get embedded in their files or something, so that they see what you say about them and, oh, I don't want that in there. And then unique value is if you want those to be completely unique so that you can't have two MIS IDs that are the same, this will mean that every single instance of this has to be unique. You have to be careful with this one because I think you can run into problems with, for example, if you tried that on Boolean, bad things would probably happen. So I'm going to go ahead and save them. Now, if we wanted to use these, we would go ahead and we could create a what's called a job ticket layout. And the first thing we have to do when we define one of these is tell it what scope this job ticket layout is allowed in. So we could do new demo corp customer settings, maybe we'll call it. And we had to choose what scope this applies at. Here I'm going to make it customer. For some things that, for other scopes, and I don't want to get too deep into job ticket layouts today, but for some other things like document, if you set this global on, then that means that that's available system-wide. Otherwise, if you want a project template to show up, you need to explicitly add it to someone's template, which I can show you later. But customer metadata is always global. Actually, I'll check it just in case. And so we can go ahead then and maybe we just want to drag in our properties. Give this a nice name, border. So let's see here. So we'll go in here and we'll put in, I think I need to set this so it's not too wide too. So maybe put the width to 600. And we can drag in the assigned CSR, MIS ID, and special notes. And actually, let's add a for that MIS ID just to show. If I go back to here, let's add a regular expression in for this just for fun. So here's one for, it needs to be 2 uppercase letters followed by 4 numbers. So now if I go back to my customer setup, we have our new customer settings job ticket. And I can go ahead and you can see it defaulted to Nora for the CSR, but I can change that. If I try and save this, that actually should yell at me because I think that's a required field unless I click the wrong thing. But you'll see if I type in something random here, it yells at me because it doesn't match the format for the thing. So I have to do 2 letters followed by 4 numbers here. And if I do that, then I can go ahead and save. So that's how you create a job ticket layout. Now, if you want to use it to do something, usually you're dealing with workflow. So how this would work is We'll make a new workflow here. Or actually, we can use the one I was looking at earlier, just to show that example I showed earlier where we skipped an approval step. When files come into the workflow here, what I did is I had a special link in here. And the link type for this is what we call the condition editor. And this allows you to define different conditions that need to be met for files to follow a specific path. So what this is saying is that this link here, it'll skip the photography approval, it'll follow this link here and go on to marketing approval only if the is stock photo metadata at the document level is set to true. If you wanted to here, and this other link here was just set to if no other link matches. So by default, it's going to go down here. If that metadata for stock photo is set, then it's going to follow this and continue on. Now, you can make this trickier if you want to. They don't have to be something like that. So you could do you could have multiple conditions. You could say, if it's a stock photo and retouch location, if it's a stock photo and the retouch location isn't New Orleans, then skip that step if only one of those retouch facilities wants to skip that approval. That's set to end right now, which means that that'll only happen if both of those conditions are true. You could also do an or, which will happen if either of those two conditions are true. In this case, either if it's marked as a stock photo or if it's coming from the New Orleans retouch location, then it would skip that photography approval. Only one exclusive or means that it'll skip that if either it's a stock photo or it's being processed in New Orleans, but not both. And then none would skip that only if it wasn't a stock photo and it wasn't being processed in New Orleans. Should have changed that sign there, that was getting a little too confusing. You can also nest these too though, because you could say that, for example, we've got a new group here. So we could do for condition, webinar. I think actually if you pull from, there's a lot of other standard metadata sets. So I guess I can't, I was trying to get tricky there. I was trying to see if you could set it to before a certain date. I think if you, yeah, you can do for this. So here's an example of how complex you can get with this thing. You can say that you want to skip that approval step if it's a stock photo and it either has a secret message embedded in it or it was created before October 5th. So you can control very fine-grained which path in the workflow you want this file to go down. You can also use these to pass on, for example, parameters to twist or set output settings. So for the digital delivery here, you could use, if I click here rather than actually specifying a certain output channel, I can click the little gears here. For the expression type, I could set that to metadata set. And I could tell it to use the value of a metadata, tell it that a piece of text metadata somewhere in my system has the name of the output channel to use for delivery. The one example I had that wasn't quite working from earlier was, it was an old example I kind of dug up. I hadn't had a chance to retest, but this job, there was a project level job ticket that was used to set the approval or the output format that was desired, whether it was X1A or X4 for the PDF. When I went to send the file to eTwist for normalization, there was a variable in there that basically looked at the metadata, the training metadata set, the PDF format metadata at the project level. So they were setting a setting at the project level. Do I have a project here I can look at? Let's see. Yeah, here's the output settings. Is that not gonna load for me? I guess it's not my day. But yeah, the option was either X1 or X4, and then that gets sent to Twist. And then Twist could then use that. This would then take that variable that was being passed from ES that was being set in the job ticket, pass to Twist, and then use to overload the output type in OPDF. So that's how you can use that in ES. So the one important thing to note too is if you want to store that in the file and recall that later on, like I did here, these don't automatically get written into files by default. So that information there, normally that just gets stored in the ES database. If you want that to be written into the file, what you have to do is twofold. First, in the customization area, you have to have that save an XMP box checked. The second thing you have to do is you have to have the, if we go to, where's my workflow? Actually, I'll go back here. Where was I? Okay, here we go. Yeah, you have to add in here, there's a tool called insert metadata. And that tool does is it formally writes anything that has that save and XMP checked in the metadata set, it'll write into the actual file itself. So if you don't have this, then the metadata stays in ES but doesn't get written into the file. So that's one thing to keep an eye out for. I think the last thing I have to mention with
Important to
this
note that
is
that's on projects. On the file system, you can have it checked to write the metadata into the file.
yeah, that's a good point there. There is actually a setting for that in, you go to volumes. If you were to create a file system, there's an option here, update metadata in document. And if you're using a file system and you check that box, then it will always automatically update the metadata in the file whenever it's updated in ES.
And if I remember correctly, that can't be used with S3.
Makes sense. I think the last thing I had here for that setup was, since I was writing that metadata into the file, you can also reference these in links. You don't have to use just the conditional links like this, where we're setting a condition and saying follow the link if it matches this. You can also access and manipulate the metadata directly in these program links. So I have one here at the very end that I use to write that metadata in for Photoshop. And the syntax in here is context.set metadata. And what that does is allows you to set any metadata you want. You have the first parameter is the scope, which is page order if it's a page, job if it's a job, I think customer if it's a customer, Most of them tend to match what you'd expect, except page order tends to be the tricky one. You've got the name of the metadata set, you've got the name of the metadata property, and you've also got whatever you're setting for it. So here it was after my file was approved, I set the final approval date to the current time. I set the secret message to that string here. And there were a few other things I synchronized from a scope level. The job code, for example, that's something that existed at the job level. I didn't want to store that necessarily. That wasn't something that was necessarily going to be set at the page level, but that's something I wanted to pass on to Photoshop down the line here. So that's something that's important to keep in mind is scope. You can synchronize. Basically what I did here is I synchronized the scope. I used this context.get metadata to grab the job code metadata from the webinar metadata set at the job level. And then I turned around and then used the context.set metadata method here to write that into the job code metadata at the page scope. So the page had a copy of that metadata as well. So I think I actually have, I should have put it up here. Let me see if I can find it real quick. I had a script I wrote recently. It's a really nice way to synchronize those automatically if you have a bunch. Where that tends to be a problem sometimes is if you're doing upload metadata. I think they might have actually changed it a little in ES6, but sometimes if you're setting metadata on this upload and you drop in a whole bunch of files, then that metadata there gets what's called file bag metadata rather than page order. So it actually worked here. I don't think I had to do that for these files, but that's something to watch out for if you put a job ticket on an uploader like this and you're not seeing the metadata in the workflow, you might need to synchronize it. Let me see if I can find that sample real quick. That was pretty cool. I think I have it right here somewhere. If not, I don't. If I don't have it, I don't have it. But I can put up. I'll put up a little blurb when we put up the video of this with the information because, or actually, no, is it? Yeah, here it is. It's a little too messy. I can explain that more in the next follow-up webinar. But what that does is I just made a list of metadata that existed at the I guess that existed at the page level, at the job level, and I wanted to synchronize that to the page. I made a list of those sets, the metadata with the property, with the set name and the property name, and I looped through that list and retrieved them from the job level and then set them to at the page level. So you can script, so it's pretty easy to script if you need to synchronize that metadata for these things. Now, if you're trying to figure out which property names to use for these, you don't always have to run back to the setup screen. You can click on one of these steps here, and if you go to Wiffle Log, Show Context, then you can go in here and click through and see all the metadata in here. And it'll actually show you if you want to see how you would reference some of these things. You can click the little I button here, and it'll tell you what syntax you would have to use to get that metadata in a program link. The Java and Tickle options here are just leftovers from an older version of ES. But so you just want the JavaScript one, but then you can copy and paste that and take that and run with that in a workflow, and that'll give you a variable with that contents of that metadata. So I think that's the gist of all that. One thing I forgot to show earlier that I should real quick is in addition to the searching at the beginning, you can also use these in smart views. So for example, if you had all the information we're collecting here and you want a view of that data in ES that shows you all this, then you can make a custom smart view that has all that information in here so that you can filter by job code or intent, or even put filters in. So if users want to be able to search for and filter on files with certain settings, they can do so. So
All right.
that's
That it?
that. I had a few more things I wanted to go over. I think that's the meat of the setup. There were a few pitfalls I wanted to go through real quick, and then I wanted to say a brief word on using the right tool for the right job. So I think I'll go to slides for this. So for common pitfalls, there are a few pitfalls we tend to run into with metadata in ES a lot. The first one is really large metadata. There is a Photoshop history and piece of metadata. I think it's usually called like document ancestors. I might actually have one if I go to the other screen. I can't show the file because it's a customer file, but I can load the text of that metadata set because I have one because we just got a ticket about one of these last week. I think I have it.
We got 3 tickets on from separate customers on this.
I think I actually deleted the file already. It's a shame. But it's if you try and load this in these files in, like if you go to, for example, Bridge, and was it not, it's not D, I think it's properties maybe. What was the, somehow messed up my view here in very short order. File info. And you go to see like the raw metadata, property info in here. For those files, it's I think what Photoshop does is every time you make an adjustment to those files, it'll save a line. And we've got files where there's like 30, 40 megabytes worth of metadata. And if you try to open it in an Adobe product like Bridge or Photoshop, it'll say metadata too large to display. The problem with that metadata is if you run into that, then you upload that to ES, and when ES tries to extract that metadata, it'll hang on it. It's not just a Dalim problem in this case. If you Google like Photoshop ancestor metadata online, you'll see people all over using all sorts of different applications running into grief with this. So that's one thing to watch out for if you have a file that comes in and it gets stuck during preview generation. Usually because preview generation is the step in the workflow that does the metadata extraction. That might be the cause. I think this has gotten better in recent builds because we haven't had, I tested on a more recent build from a few weeks ago, and the files for those 3 tickets Fred mentioned didn't cause problems for me. So I think Dalim might have some code in to ignore that metadata now. If not, there is a env.sh option I'll append to the recording that you can put in to disable metadata collection if you want, but that tends to be overkill. The other workaround we usually use for this when it becomes a problem for customers, there's a script step you can stick in your workflow that you use that would call, there's a Linux command line utility called exiftool that can be used to strip metadata out of files. So sometimes we'll use a script step that calls exiftool to scrub that specific problem metadata property from files. One other one I'll mention, I didn't really get to the twist stuff as much as I was hoping today. The ES Connect communication is one way here. There's a way in, it's very easy to send, if you're using ES Connect, metadata data to Twist from ES, but it's a little more difficult to send metadata back to ES. If you're using eTwist, there is a way that you can basically send a JDF out back to ES. If you're using ES Connect, the only way to get metadata back to ES would be to use the insert metadata tool. And you could literally stuff metadata into a file that way, and then ES can read that. So that's one thing to watch out for. There's no way to read metadata in input rules right now. So if you're setting some metadata in Photoshop, like this retouch location, and you want to be able to send files to a certain workflow in ES, you can do that, but it's not as easy as it would be. That's something we can maybe discuss in the next one, but there's no way to read that input rules right now. You can set metadata in input rules, but so that when it gets to the workflow in ES, it has some metadata, but there's no way to read it direct in the input rule and use that to control what workflow file gets assigned, for example. You can work around it, just a little messy. If ES file IDs get written into metadata, that can cause problems with future files. This was, if you go to customization, metadata sets, I think the page information is the one where ES stores page information. I think there's in here, there's like document name and yeah, page order, I think it's page order name. And ooh, that one actually is set to save in XMP, so that might still be an issue here. I think it's page order name and doc ID are the big ones that you don't want set to save in XMP. Because if I go over here and look at those, I think I have the document ID. It's just ES's internal ID for this file. And then maybe the document name isn't searchable, but it was in the files. Or probably is here, I'm just not seeing it. Search for doc. Maybe that one's not searchable here. But we ran into problems years ago where there was a customer that was, they had files on an ES file system that was set to automatically write every change into metadata. And it kept writing the document ID and the document name, ES's document name into the metadata. And the problem is that they would go and retouch that file and they'd upload a new revision or a different version of it with a different name or different ID or whatever. And the problem they'd run into is that old one got written into metadata by ES. And so that's what ES would see it as in search. So they would search for whatever the current file name was and it wouldn't show up in search. So those are, if you're having problems with that, that's one thing to check that you might want to disable. One other one is too much searchable metadata. If you have a lot of searchable metadata set up in some of these sets, and I think Dalim has a ton of it on by default. For example, yeah, I think there's like the default Photoshop one here. Most of them are set to searchable by default. And that can lead to two problems. One, it can be really bad for search performance if you've got thousands of metadata properties in these files that are being ingested into ES. That can cause increased resource usage for ES's search engine, and it can also lead to slower searching. And in some cases, especially if you're dealing with numbers, it can lead to false positives. So if I do like search for, I think I have the really bad one disabled in my system. There was one that Dalim used to use called, they use for like if you're using the similarity or the AI thing to search for similar images, that puts a ton of random digits into metadata. Or even if, like if we look at something like, yeah, that was the one someone had grief with recently was file size. So 143. So if someone was looking for, you had some job ID of 143, or there was a file that had 143 in the name, and you search for 143, you might get this file. If the file size in this document information is set to be searchable, then you might get this file returned even though it doesn't have the 143 in the name, and that can be confusing for end users. I think those, I don't know if I have those disabled in my system right now. I can try it real quick. I'll do 143 star. Yeah, you can see this shows up. Someone might search because they're trying to find files with 143 in the name. This shows up because the file name was 143,000 kilobytes or whatever it is, and they're wondering why they're getting all these false positives, which would be much more on a large production system rather than my small test VM. So my recommendation there is make only the fields that you want to search for searchable, disable search for the rest. I would leave alone any of the ES ones. So anything that begins with the ES, PO, like I think like document ID and document name have to be searchable, but you can turn off a lot of the other ones. If you do that, then you have to do a full reindex under system configuration, and that can take about 2 or 3 days. So that's something to leave for the weekend. If that's something you're thinking about doing at some point, you can always open a ticket and ask us, and we'll give you our recommendations. The last one is, I don't think we have anyone on that I can taunt for this who was involved in this, but one other thing to watch out for is concurrency. If you had, for example, a job, like a project job ticket, where you're trying to edit like this field in a project job ticket, and so you put a link in your document workflow that does some like context.set metadata to overwrite this, you can run into system performance issues if you have 1,000 documents all trying to update the same piece of job metadata at the same time. So that's something to be judicious with as well. I know we're running short on time. I kind of cramming everything in as best I can. The one
No.
last thing I wanted to mention, and I don't want to, I don't know if I have time to go really into depth on it, but there's a few different ways, well, as in depth on it as I wanted to. I'll be brief and we can talk about it more in the next one. Metadata isn't the only way to store information in ES. There are also variables which can be set in the workflow with context, instead of context, should make that a little bigger. So you've got context that's set metadata where you've got your metadata set, all that stuff. There's also a context.set variable, and that doesn't have all the metadata set stuff. It's just you have a variable name and a variable value. And the last place where information can be set is what are called process parameters. If I go to, where's it hiding on me? Down here. And you can see there's another dump for settings in here where you can actually add your own settings in here as well. I did a webinar on these a few years ago, but it comes down to there's 3 different ways here we have of setting these. We have metadata, variables, and process parameters. Which is the best tool for which job? I think I'll elaborate on this whenever the next one is, but I think in general, the rule is metadata is very good if you have information that's tied to a specific thing in ES, like a page or a customer or a project. It's good for that because it's scoped to those specific points. So if you have information that variables are related to a specific run of a workflow. So a variable is like a sort of temp thing you can set in the workflow during a run to kind of take a snapshot of maybe what a variable looked like at a certain point in time, or just for debugging purposes, write in that you've reached a certain point in the workflow. And then the process parameters are just large scale settings that are used for lots of customers. You can have multiple process parameters. These get linked to the project template that the customer uses. Is that a list of what parameter set they use there? So I think without getting too much into the specifics, and I know this is going to be too vague, but I would say if information is something that needs to be set for large numbers of customers, mostly system-wide, then I would configure it as a process parameter. If something is tied to a specific customer or specific page, or maybe 1 or 2 pages or 1 or 2 projects, then that's something that would be best fit in metadata. If something is tied to a specific run of a workflow, then that would go as a variable. So that's pretty much the gist of it. Are there any questions?
I think we could answer any questions offline since we're already up to an hour and a half.
Okay, well, thank you for attending. I apologize again for the technical gaffes at the beginning. Hope you found this useful.
Good job, Alex.
Thank you.
And
Have a
everybody,
good
we'll
one,
talk to
everyone.
y'all third Wednesday of December, doing a Worldwide Technology Week recap. Again, Worldwide Technology meeting, I believe it starts December 6th through 10th. If you're interested, Dalim should have sent out a mailer with registration information. Obviously, you're welcome to travel there. Or that they are doing the virtual event like they did last year as well, which was very well done. So get in touch with us if you're interested and haven't seen an invite for that. Some good information includes 2 days of basically a conference and then really 2.5 days, I guess, of actual training on ES6 and stuff. Different pricing for different options. So everybody have a great day and a happy Thanksgiving.